At my own wedding, I watched my relatives laugh in my father's face because of his cheap suit and the envelope he nervously held in his hands. They whispered that he was a loser, a leech, a man who had nothing to offer his son but embarrassment. Back then, none of them knew that this loser would one day sign a deal that made him a billionaire and put his legacy and their fate in my hands. What would you have done if you were me? Read to the end and tell me if I went too far or not far enough. I still wake up some nights wondering whether what I did was justice or just revenge dressed up to look like it. My name is Thomas Reed. I'm 70 years old, a retired civil engineer, widower, and grandfather of 4. I've spent my life building roads and bridges across the Midwest, but this story isn't about concrete or steel. It's about one evening in 1984, the way my family laughed at the man who raised me, and how almost 40 years later, with more money than most people ever see in a lifetime, I finally answered that laughter. Back then, I was 29, marrying the woman I thought I'd grow old with, Laura Thompson. Her family had money, old Cincinnati money, as they liked to remind anyone within hearing distance. Her father owned a chain of car dealerships. Her mother played tennis at a country club whose membership cost more than my yearly salary. They spoke the language of stock portfolios and ski trips to Vail. My father, Henry Reed, did not. Dad was a quiet man from Dayton who fixed factory machines for a living. Grease under his nails, hands scarred from decades of wrenching bolts in cold warehouses. After my mother died when I was 16, he took double shifts to keep our small house and still send me to college. He wore the same Navy suit to job fairs, funerals, and my graduation. He was proud of that suit. It was the only one he owned. When Laura insisted on a country club wedding, I argued for something smaller. She cried, her mother frowned, and her father said he'd cover most of it if we did it properly. I caved. I told myself it didn't matter where we got married as long as I was marrying her. On the day of the wedding, I arrived in a rented tuxedo. White chairs lined the manicured lawn. A string quartet played under a white tent. Waiters moved through the crowd with silver trays. It felt like stepping into a magazine advertisement for a life that didn't belong to me. Then I saw my father. He stood near the edge of the crowd, clutching a plain white envelope so tightly the paper had creased. The same navy suit, shoulders a little more slumped, tie carefully knotted but slightly crooked. His shoes were polished within an inch of their lives, but the leather was cracked, betraying their age. He looked like a man who had tried very hard to be worthy of the moment, and knew deep down that others might not see it that way. "Dad," I said, walking over, forcing cheer into my voice. "You made it." He smiled, and for a moment I saw the man who'd taught me to ride a bike in our cracked driveway. "Wouldn't miss it, Tommy," he said. "Got the day off, even shaved." He laughed, touching his smooth cheek, then looked around. "This place is something else." Before I could answer, my Aunt Diane floated up, clutching a champagne flute. She was my mother's younger sister, remarried to a man who liked to talk about his diversified portfolio at Thanksgiving. She'd always treated my father like a temporary inconvenience attached to me. "Tommy," she cooed, air-kissing my cheek. "You look wonderful. Oh, Henry, you're here." Her eyes flicked from his suit to the envelope in his hand, and the corner of her mouth twitched. "I wouldn't miss my boy's big day," Dad said, offering his hand. She took it with 2 fingers, as if it might be oily. Of course," she said. "Well, if you need anything, Tommy, the open bar is over there and the Thompsons have organized everything. You just relax and enjoy." She drifted away toward a cluster of relatives near the bar. I turned back to Dad. "You okay?" I asked quietly. "Fine," he said. "Just proud." He patted my arm and shuffled off to find a seat in the second row. He didn't push his way up front. He never did. That was my father, always making himself smaller so others could feel bigger. The ceremony itself went smoothly. Laura walked down the aisle in a dress that cost more than my first car. Her father dabbed at his eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. Her family clapped like they'd just acquired a new piece of property. It wasn't until the reception that the real damage started. The speeches began with Laura's father, who told a long story about her childhood tennis trophies and how we always knew Laura would marry up. The room laughed politely, not realizing, or not caring, that I was the one being placed below some invisible line. Then came my turn. I had asked Dad if he wanted to say a few words. He'd hesitated, then nodded. "I'm not much for speeches, but I'll try," he'd said. Now he rose from his chair, napkin dropping into his lap, and shuffled toward the microphone. The quartet fell silent. The clinking of cutlery faded. He held the envelope in one hand, the microphone in the other, and cleared his throat. "I'm Henry," he began. "Tommy's dad. Most of you don't know me. I fix machines for a living. I'm not rich like some of you folks." A ripple of laughter moved through the room. I saw Laura's mother stiffen. Her father's jaw tightened. Dad noticed, faltered, then forced a smile. "But I had one job in life," he continued, voice trembling just a little, "and that was to raise a good man. I may not have much, but I have that. I'm proud of you, son." He opened the envelope and pulled out a check, the paper shaking between his fingertips. It's not a lot by some standards," he said, "but it's everything I could put together. $10,000. I cashed out the little retirement I had left, for a down payment on a house or whatever you need." The room was quiet for half a second. Then my cousin Mark, already 2 drinks in at the next table, whispered just loud enough to carry, "10 grand? That's cute. My dad spent more on the flowers." Someone snorted. Someone else chuckled. Aunt Diane didn't even bother to hide her smile. On the Thompson side, a few faces twisted into polite pity. As Dad stepped away from the microphone, trying to hand me the check, Laura's mother leaned toward her sister and murmured, "Well, at least he tried." Her sister replied, "I thought he was the janitor." They both laughed. Dad heard that. I saw his shoulders twitch. He held out the check. I took it because not taking it would have broken him on the spot. I wanted to turn and tell them all to stop, to pick up Dad's dignity off that polished floor and push it back into his hands. But the cameras were pointed at us. Laura was smiling tightly. Her parents were watching me, waiting to see if I'd make a scene. I swallowed hard and smiled for the photographer instead. Later that night, I found Dad alone in the parking lot, sitting on the tailgate of his old Ford, tie loosened, jacket folded beside him. "Sorry I embarrassed you," he said, staring at his hands. "You didn't," I said too quickly. That's how they are." He nodded, but he didn't look at me. "I heard what they said," he murmured. "Janitor." He laughed once, a dry sound. "I've been called worse at the plant." I should have said something, I admitted. He looked up then, eyes wet but steady. "It was your wedding day. Your job was to marry your wife. My job was to be proud of you. That's enough." We sat in silence for a while. Finally he stood, his knees popping. "Listen," he said. "This is going to sound foolish, but I've been thinking. I'm not going to retire the way I planned. Maybe I've got one more thing in me. Something big. Something that makes them remember my name for more than 10 seconds. I frowned. "Dad, you don't owe them anything." "I know," he said. "I owe it to myself." He climbed into his truck, started the engine, and drove away into the darkness, the tail lights shrinking until they were swallowed by the night. I watched him go, holding a check that represented everything he had, and felt a shame I wouldn't fully understand for decades. Life moved forward. Laura and I had 2 children, Michael and Emily. I worked my way up through a civil engineering firm. The Thompsons remained exactly who they'd always been. Country club memberships, New cars every 2 years, charity galas where they could be photographed, handing checks to people who actually needed them. My father, meanwhile, remained in his small house in Dayton. He still drove the old Ford for another 5 years before it finally died. When I offered to help him buy a new car, he refused. "I've got it covered," he said. He started talking about projects and a buddy from the plant who's got an idea. He asked me strange questions about patents, liability, and company structures. I assumed it was just idle talk, a way for him to feel like he was still in the game. Then, slowly, little details began to change. He stopped asking to borrow money. He mentioned flying to Houston for meetings. He paid off his mortgage early. When I visited, I noticed new tools in his garage, high-end equipment I knew he couldn't afford on a mechanic's salary. "Did you win the lottery?" I joked once. "In a manner of speaking," he said, eyes crinkling. "Just finally getting paid for using my head instead of my back." I shrugged it off. I was busy raising kids and trying to hold my marriage together. Laura had grown increasingly dissatisfied with the life I could afford. "Your father tried," she'd say whenever money came up. "But look where that got him. Do you want your children repeating that story?" By the time I was 52, Laura and I were divorced. She remarried quickly, this time to a man with a vacation home in Naples and season tickets for the Bengals. I moved into a modest townhouse and focused on my work and my kids. Dad never said a single bad word about her. He just kept working on whatever it was he was building. The truth came out when I was 56. I remember the day clearly. I was in my office staring at a pile of bridge inspection reports when my phone rang. An unfamiliar number flashed on the screen. "Thomas Reed?" a man's voice asked when I answered. "Yes." "This is Robert Cullen, attorney representing HR. Dynamics. Your father asked me to schedule a meeting with you at your earliest convenience. He said it was time you saw what he'd been up to." "HR Dynamics?" I repeated. "What's that?" "His company," the man said, as if I should have known. "He'll explain when you get here." 2 days later, I walked into a glass tower in downtown Cincinnati that I'd driven past 100 times without really seeing. The lobby floor was polished stone, the ceiling high enough to swallow my old neighborhood whole. A plaque near the elevator listed the building's tenants. At the top, in understated steel letters, HR Dynamics. The receptionist greeted me by name and led me to a corner conference room with windows overlooking the Ohio River. My father was already there, sitting at the head of the table in a button-down shirt and slacks that fit him better than anything I'd ever seen him wear. "Hey, Tommy," he said, rising to hug me. I stared at him, then at the room. "Dad, what is this?" He motioned for me to sit. "Remember that buddy from the plant?" he asked. He had a problem. The machines kept breaking down, and the company wouldn't invest in better ones. So I started tinkering. He smiled faintly. "Turns out a lifetime of fixing other people's bad designs gives you ideas." He explained in simple terms how he'd invented a new kind of vibration sensor for industrial equipment. Cheaper, more accurate, easier to install. How he'd patented it with the help of a small business lawyer. How a Houston firm had licensed it. How, when the royalties started coming in, he'd formed HR Dynamics to manage the contracts, then use the profits to fund other ideas. I listened, stunned, as his attorney slid documents across the table. Company valuations, licensing agreements, a recent acquisition offer. "They want to buy us outright," Dad said, tapping a number that made my stomach roll. "Cash and stock." I stared at the page. The zeros blurred. "Dad," I whispered, Is this real?" He nodded. "It took a while, a lot of trial and error, but I told you that night in the parking lot I had one more thing in me." I did the math in my head. The offer was structured over several years, but the immediate payout alone would make him wealthier than anyone I'd ever met in real life. "This is—" I struggled for words. "This is billionaire money." He shrugged almost shyly. "If the market holds, maybe. But it's just numbers. What matters is what we do with them. He slid another folder toward me. I need a successor, he said. Someone I trust. The lawyers call it an heir to the estate. I call it my kid who didn't laugh when I wore the same suit to every important day of his life. Inside the folder was a set of documents naming me as his primary heir, executor of his will, and co-trustee of several foundations he'd already started. I want to set up scholarships, he said, for kids like you and me, working-class first-generation college. I want to fund medical research, fix a few things I can't fix with a wrench. He paused, meeting my eyes. And I want you and your kids taken care of. What about Aunt Diane, Cousin Mark, the Thompsons? I asked before I could stop myself. His mouth tightened. I remember what they said that night, he said quietly. I remember feeling small in a room I helped pay for. If you decide to forgive them, that's your choice. But I'm not obligated to leave anything to people who laughed at the sound of my name. Something inside me shifted then. All the swallowed words from that parking lot, all the quiet humiliations I'd brushed aside to keep the peace, rose like a tide. Dad watched my face and nodded slowly. I know you, Tommy, he said. You'll want to be fair. I trust your idea of fair. He signed the papers in front of me, his signature steady. When it was done, he placed the pen down and folded his hands. When I'm gone, he said, you'll have the power to decide who gets what, who keeps what, and who walks away with nothing but their memories. Just promise me one thing. What's that? I asked. Don't let anyone make you feel small while you're holding the keys to the kingdom. That might have been the end of it. A surprising turn in an old man's life, a comfortable inheritance waiting somewhere on the horizon. But families have a way of returning to the scene of their worst behavior. 2 years later, we all met again at the same country club where Laura and I had been married. This time it was for my daughter Emily's wedding. She'd chosen the venue because it photographs well, unaware, or maybe unconcerned about the ghosts it stirred in me. Dad was 78 then, moving slower, his hair thinner, but his eyes as sharp as ever. He'd insisted on wearing a new suit. I think I've earned it, he joked. His wealth remained largely a secret. He still lived in his modest house, still drove a practical car, not the Ford, but nothing flashy. The only obvious sign was the quiet authority with which people at HR Dynamics deferred to him when I visited. Our relatives remained oblivious. Aunt Diane arrived in a dress that screamed money. Her husband, Larry, wore a watch so large it looked like it could track satellites. Cousin Mark boasted loudly about his real estate investments, conveniently leaving out the part where most of them were underwater. They all greeted Dad the same way they always had, politely, dismissively. "Henry," Diane said, air-kissing the air near his cheek, "still tinkering with those machines?" "Something like that," he replied. During the cocktail hour, I watched Mark corner him near the bar. "So," Mark said, gesturing with his drink, "you still in that old house in Dayton? Must be rough on a fixed income. Maybe you should think about moving in with Tommy before you end up in, you know." He didn't say nursing home, but it hung there. Dad smiled faintly. "I get by?" "Well, if you ever need advice on investments, you know where to find me," Mark said. "I'm managing multiple properties now." I knew, thanks to a quiet conversation with Dad's lawyer, that one of those properties technically belonged to an LLC owned by HR Dynamics. Mark had no idea his landlord was standing in front of him in an off-the-rack suit. As the evening wore on, the pattern repeated. Little jabs at my father's clothes, his age, his humble lifestyle. No one asked what he actually did. No one cared to know. At one point, I found him alone on the balcony, staring out over the golf course where years ago I'd watched him sit on the tailgate of his truck, apologizing for existing. "You okay?" I asked. He nodded. "Just thinking." "About what?" He rested his hands on the railing. "You ever notice," he said, "how the people who laugh the loudest at a man's struggle are the same ones who knock on his door when they think he might have something to give?" I thought about the check he'd written for my wedding. The way they'd laughed. The folders he'd signed in that glass tower. "Yes," I said. "I've noticed." He glanced at me sideways. "You're their landlord, you know," he said lightly. I blinked. "What?" He smiled. "That duplex Mark keeps bragging about flipping? The mortgage is owned by a holding company. That holding company is owned by HR Dynamics. We picked it up as part of a distressed property package after the last downturn." I stared at him. "You never said anything." He shrugged. "Didn't seem important. Besides, the bank was going to foreclose. We gave him better terms. I thought maybe he'd learn something." He looked back out at the course. He didn't. A month after Emily's wedding, Dad had a stroke. It was mild as strokes go, but it took some of the spring from his step. I drove him to appointments, sat with him in lawyers' offices as we refined the trusts and foundations he'd established. He kept insisting on channeling more and more into scholarships, community grants, clinics. "Give it away while I can still enjoy the thought of it," he said. We never spoke directly about revenge, but we didn't have to. The paperwork made it clear, outside of me and my children, no blood relative was entitled to a cent unless I chose to redirect it. He died quietly in his sleep at 81. At the funeral, my extended family wept and hugged and remembered him as such a kind man. Diane dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "He always did his best with what he had," she sniffed. "Poor Henry." Mark clapped me on the back. "Tough break, cousin. Guess he didn't have much to leave behind, but at least he had heart, right?" I said nothing. I just shook hands, accepted condolences, and tucked their words away like receipts. 3 weeks later, after the estate had been formally valued and the first transfers made, I invited the entire family, including the Thompson side, to a family appreciation dinner. I booked the same private hall at the country club. When Diane got the invitation, she called me immediately. "Is this about the house?" she asked. "You know, if you're thinking of selling Henry's place, Larry might be interested in picking it up as a rental. We could take it off your hands." "I'll explain everything at the dinner," I said. The night of the event, they arrived dressed as if for a gala. Larry in a new suit, Mark in a flashy blazer. Even Laura's parents came, drawn by the curiosity of any rich family sensing the vibrations of money. The room was set much like my wedding reception had been. Round tables, white linens, soft music. But this time there was no band, no bouquet, no cake. Just a podium, a screen, and a stack of folders in front of my place. I waited until everyone had eaten, until the wine had loosened tongues and lower voices began to ask the question they were all thinking. "Do you think Henry had a life insurance policy?" "He must have something. A pension?" "Maybe Tom found something in the house." I stood and tapped my glass. "Thank you all for coming," I began. "I know it's unusual to gather like this after a funeral, but my father asked me in writing to do something specific with his legacy. I intend to honor that." The room quieted. Diane straightened in her chair. Mark leaned forward. "What legacy?" he called, half joking. "Henry's tool collection?" Laughter flickered around the table. My hands tightened around the edge of the podium. The ghosts of that first wedding night rose up around me. My father's shaking hands, the smirk on Mark's face, the sound of Laura's aunt saying, "I thought he was the janitor." I took a breath. "In 1990, I said, my father filed his first patent. In 1993, he licensed that patent to an industrial firm in Houston. In 1998, he formed HR Dynamics. Some of you may recognize the name." I clicked the remote. The screen behind me lit up with the company logo, then a headline from a business magazine, "Local Founder's Quiet Empire, the Billion-Dollar Mechanic." The room went absolutely still. "The company my father built," I continued, "was acquired 3 years ago. The final payments cleared last fall. After taxes, charitable commitments, and existing obligations, my father died with a net worth just over $1.8 billion. Someone dropped a fork. It clattered against fine china. Diane's mouth fell open. Larry's hand froze halfway to his glass. Mark stared at the screen, eyes darting over the numbers as if they might rearrange themselves into something more manageable. "You're joking," Laura's father said weakly. I shook my head. "I wish I were. Maybe then he'd still be here to see your faces." A brittle laugh escaped me before I could stop it. I let it die in the quiet. "My father chose to live simply," I said. "He stayed in his old house. He wore inexpensive suits. He let you believe he was poor because he learned a long time ago that some people only know how to relate to others through money." A flush crept up Diane's neck. "We never—" she began. I raised a hand. "Before anyone rewrites history, let me remind you of a specific night in 1984. You all remember my wedding, I'm sure." "I do." "My father stood at a microphone in this very room and gave me a check for everything he'd saved. $10,000. Some of you laughed. Some of you called him a janitor. Some of you decided right then what his value was." Diane's eyes filled. Mark shifted in his seat, unable to meet my gaze. "I was a coward," I said. "I didn't defend him the way I should have. I've lived with that for 40 years. This is my chance to correct that." I gestured to the stack of folders. "These are summaries of my father's estate plan. I'll be calling your names one by one. Inside, you'll see exactly what he left you." The tension in the room sharpened into something almost physical. The air felt heavy, charged. "Aunt Diane," I said, "would you come up, please?" She rose on shaky legs, smoothing her dress, a hopeful, practiced smile on her lips. The same smile she used when introducing herself to someone she thought might be useful. I handed her a thin folder. She opened it right there, unable to wait. Her eyes scanned the single page inside. I watched the blood drain from her face. "What is this?" she whispered. "It's a letter," I said calmly. "Read it out loud." Her hand trembled. The room leaned forward. She swallowed. "Dear Diane," she read. "You once taught me, by example, that money is the measure of a man. Thank you for that lesson. It helped me decide what to do with mine. I leave you exactly what you believed I was worth that night at Tommy's wedding. Nothing. Sincerely, Henry." She looked up at me, stunned. "There must be some mistake," she said. He can't mean—" "There's no mistake," I said. "The will has been executed. The courts have signed off. You received exactly what he wanted you to have." I called Larry next. His folder contained a similar letter, along with a photocopy of a check Dad had written years ago to help him through a temporary business shortfall. "He apparently considered that an advance," I said. "With interest." Mark's turn came. He strutted up to the podium with forced bravado, but his hand shook as he took the folder. He opened it and stared. "No," he said. "No way." "Read it," I said softly. He clenched his jaw. "Dear Mark," he read, "congratulations on your real estate empire. It was enlightening to become your landlord without your knowledge. As of 30 days from my death, the holding company that owns your duplex will call in the balloon payment on your loan. You may either meet the terms in full or sell. I suggest you treat your tenants better than you treated me. Sincerely, Henry." Mark crumpled the letter. "You can't do this," he snarled. "I've put everything into that property." "You should have read your loan documents more carefully," I said. "I brought copies in case you forgot." I signaled to Dad's attorney, who handed me a thick envelope. I dropped it into Mark's hands. "This is illegal," he protested. "It's contractual," the attorney corrected mildly. "You signed. Mr. Reed Sr. simply bought the note. Your obligations remain exactly what they were before, only your creditor has changed." Mark turned on me, eyes blazing. "You're doing this," he said. "You and your dead old man." Something in me snapped. "No," I said quietly. "You did this. Every time you laughed at his suit, every time you talked about him like he was a burden, every sneer, Every joke. He owed you nothing. He still gave you better terms than the bank. This is him choosing, finally, to stop subsidizing your contempt. Around the room, the pattern continued. To those who had been quietly kind over the years, my cousin Lisa, who had visited when Dad was in the hospital, my nephew who had mowed his lawn without being asked, there were small bequests, college funds, down payments. To Laura's parents, who had treated him like furniture at both weddings, there was a formal letter and a donation receipt. In lieu of leaving money to people who measured my son by my bank account, I read, I have made a contribution in your names to a scholarship fund for students whose parents cannot afford the luxuries you take for granted. There was a murmur. Laura's mother's cheeks went scarlet. Her father's lips thinned. The only people who received substantial inheritances were my children and grandchildren. To Michael and Emily, he left secure trusts, structured to support them without enabling laziness. To my grandchildren, he left educational funds so large that their children would never have to choose between medicine and groceries. And to me, he left control. Through the Reed Foundation, I explained, we will fund trade school programs, engineering scholarships, and medical clinics all over the Midwest. $3 million has already been set aside for a vocational center in Dayton. That's where the bulk of his estate is gone. I paused, looking around at faces that had gone from greedy anticipation to shock to anger in less than an hour. If you're wondering why he chose this path, I said, I'll tell you what he told me. I took a breath. The room blurred at the edges, not from wine, but from memory. He said, I spent my life fixing broken machines, Tommy. In the end, I want my money to fix broken systems, not broken manners. Silence. Someone's chair scraped against the floor. A wine glass chimed. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Diane exploded. You vindictive old man, she spat, tears streaming. You think this makes you better? Punishing family from beyond the grave? I held her gaze. He gave you 40 years to be decent, I said. He stayed small so you could feel big. This isn't punishment. It's just finally refusing to pretend that you were anything other than what you showed him that night. She opened her mouth, then closed it. She grabbed her purse and stalked toward the door. Larry followed, muttering. Mark stayed, but only because he needed to argue with the lawyer. Others drifted out in ones and twos. Some came to me quietly, expressing honest regret. Others fumed. No one, I noticed, mentioned the scholarships or the clinics. Their grief was for the money they'd imagined, not the man they'd lost. That night, after everyone had gone, I walked through the empty hall alone. The staff had cleared the plates. The chairs were pushed in. The floor was clean, no trace of the storm that had passed through. I stood where my father had once stood with a cheap microphone and a shaking hand, offering everything he had while people laughed. I pictured him now, the same navy suit, the same shoes, the same tired eyes. Only this time, I imagined him standing not as the poorest man in the room, but as the quiet owner of more than anyone there could comprehend. I hope I did right by you, I whispered into the silence. I drove home to my modest house, the bigger one could wait, and sat at my kitchen table, documents spread out in front of me. Trust arrangements, foundation charters, letters he'd written for future scholarship recipients. One of them caught my eye. It was a form letter to be sent with each scholarship award to the students. Dear student, it began. Someone once laughed at my son because I could only give him $10,000 at his wedding. I decided that the next time I gave a young person a check, no one would laugh. Go build something good. I smiled through tears. Over the next year, I followed his plan to the letter and added a few touches of my own. When Mark failed to meet his balloon payment, the holding company foreclosed. His beloved duplex went to auction. The Reed Foundation bought it and converted it into transitional housing for single parents finishing degrees or job training programs. The first plaque on the wall read, "In honor of Henry Reed, who knew the value of second chances. We refinanced Lisa's mortgage at a rate so generous it might as well have been a gift. We paid for my nephew's medical school. We funded the vocational center in Dayton. On opening day, I stood in a crowd of people who'd never heard my family's name and watched the ribbon fall. Inside, students learned to weld, wire buildings, code machines, skills my father would have understood, even if he wouldn't have used the same words. As for my extended family, the invites stopped coming. No more Christmas cards from Diane, no more calls from Mark. The Thompson side shifted their focus to other sons-in-law, other sources of status. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder if I should have been more generous, if I should have left them something substantial, if only to keep the peace. Then I remember the sound of their laughter, the way my father's shoulders hunched, the years he spent pretending he was less than he was so they wouldn't feel threatened. He gave me the power to decide what was fair. I decided that fair meant this. The people who believed a man's worth was measured by his suit or his zip code got exactly what they'd valued him at. Nothing. Everyone else, the kids without a chance, the hard workers without a safety net, got the billion-dollar mechanic. Now, as a 70-year-old grandfather watching my grandchildren grow up in a world my father helped shape, I'm left with one lingering doubt that only someone outside the story can answer. Was I right to turn my father's billions into a weapon of quiet justice against the relatives who laughed at him? Or did I go too far, letting revenge steer the hand that signed the checks? What would you have done in my place?
My grandpa's words really happened. I believe him. If you want more true tales like this, hit subscribe.